Bagpuss. There were only ever 13 episodes made of Bagpuss. However, because it was repeated ad infinitum at lunchtimes, and I had a shocking short-term memory, it felt like 130. The shop that Bagpuss lived in didn't sell anything, a lot like the shops on the high street these days. A little girl would come by every now and then and leave lost and broken things in the window so that their owners could come and collect them. Once she left, the shop became a bit like Toy Story in that all the stuff in there came to life. A frog with a banjo, a doll with a face like she just sat on a hairbrush, and a stuffy wooden woodpecker, the irony, who spent the entire time whining about the mice who had creepily climbed out of the 2D pattern on the fireplace. Bagpuss, like any manager, sat around yawning, not doing much, barking orders at his staff, and then took all the credit once the item that they were working on had been fixed. He'd then do a huge yawn and go back to sleep and send all the things that had come to life back to being lifeless, disaffected statues with no discernible purpose or personality. The plot would have been much the same had it been set in my local branch of KFC. Cockleshell Bay. Cockleshell Bay had one of the most heartbreaking theme tunes of all time, second only to the one from the Incredible Hulk TV series. Either could happily be played over a montage on the news of a report on something awful. This was meant to be an upbeat TV kids show, and after listening to the theme at the end, I'd wander off back to school after my lunch, rethinking my life choices. I was only 4 years old. Robin and Rosie Cockle, dressed like early versions of Freddy Krueger, lived in the Bucket and Spade guest house with their parents. Their dad, Chris Cockle, bought the guest house because he didn't want to work in a factory anymore. That's a backstory I identified with more and more the older I get. It was completely lost to me back then. Chris, I liked. It was the other characters that creeped me out. First, they had a gran who wasn't actually their gran. They just called her gran. I had several aunties growing up that were not related to either of my parents. She helped out around the house, and it wasn't clear why, or if she got paid. The kids had a fisherman friend called Mr. Ship, who had sideboards like shredded wheat, who was in his late 50s. Nothing dodgy about that in the 80s, of course. Mr. McGinty was also hanging around with his face like every photo fit you've ever seen on Crime Watch, and he owned a donkey called Fury, whose choice of name was never elaborated on, and an intelligent seagull called Ben Gunn, named after the character on Treasure Island. As with all great kids' TV shows, the children in the story learn some kind of lesson, like why they shouldn't lie, why they shouldn't be late for stuff, and why you shouldn't talk to seagulls, as if they can understand what you're saying. That's only possible if you're in Disney's The Little Mermaid. Rainbow. This was one of the most iconic TV kids shows of all time. It was a kind of British Sesame Street, humans interacting with puppets and acting as if everything was completely normal, despite the 6-foot talking bear. All the characters are now considered as legendary as Bilbo Baggins or Ebenezer Scrooge. The characters, who all lived in a kind of foster home together and did nothing but argue with each other all day, included Zippy, a warning of what happens when cousins marry, George, a pink hippo with no moral fibre, Bungle, a distant relative of Chewbacca, and Geoffrey, who was their legal guardian. Zippy's eyes were made of paper and marker pen, so he couldn't blink. George, on the other hand, had blinkable eyes with long pink eyelashes, and that was probably the source of the animosity between those two. Whenever anyone got annoyed with Zippy, they'd just zip his mouth shut. And I distinctly remember the episode where Zippy realised he could simply unzip it himself, however. And it dawned on him that his actions had no consequences and quickly became a kind of despot. Bungle spent most of his time whining to Geoffrey about Zippy, and in one episode he entered the room with his lower half covered with a towel. He'd just had a bath. However, he wandered around completely naked the rest of the time, That was until bedtime, when he'd don full-body pyjamas. 1970s Bungle looked like he'd crawled out of Wes Craven's imagination, whilst the 1980s Bungle looked a lot friendlier. He had a much bigger head and seemed less likely to eat your children. There were stories, arguments, whining, arguments, and Rod, Jane and Freddie, who'd pop in, sing a song and pop back out again. What fun!